ගෙදර හැමෝගෙම මේ හිනාව හැමදාම තියාගන්න නම් රට රස්සාවට යනකොට ජාවාරම්කරුවන්ට අහුවෙන්න එපා. 1989ට කතා කරන්න. ශ්‍රී ලංකා විදේශ සේවා නියුක්ති කාර්යාංශයෙන් මතක් කිරීමක්.
I'll start with the idea of fairness, and I think everyone will agree that we will never get exact agreement on what is a fair tax system. There's always disagreement, but I want to start talking about it, not by talking about the particular issues about personal income tax or who shouldn't be paying, but fairness from the perspective of the country, of the population of the country, and particularly the poorer and more vulnerable sections of the population, including that increasing proportion of the population who are relatively aged and often have rather low incomes, which is going to be a very important issue for the future. Any government that claims to represent a population should be able to raise enough revenue to meet the basic needs of the population and of the country. And Sri Lanka historically was rather good at this. From independence until the 1980s, the government of Sri Lanka almost consistently raised revenue every year that was around 22% of gross domestic product. And that was actually quite high at the time relative to the rest of the world. But since 1990, that figure has gradually begun to slide down and down and down rather steadily with a few bumps. And I think we are now back down below 10% again. Now, it is quite clear that 10% is not enough. This is less than half the figure you would expect for a country of around Sri Lanka's average income per head. And we can see the results of this in, for example, the very poor quality of public education in Sri Lanka now, which reflects the very low government expenditure compared to other countries nearby, including South Asia. We see it also, for example, in the lack of a reasonable social safety net for the poorer part of the population. That most countries of Sri Lanka's income level have a reasonable social safety net. Sri Lanka does not have one. And there's a long list of other things, but the government simply doesn't raise enough revenue to pay for basics. And the figure of revenue as a percent of GDP for Sri Lanka is now down to the level of some countries, for example, in Africa, Nigeria, Somaliland, countries that are really, really problematic. And it is in some ways a surprise that we don't have more political unrest when we have a government that is so fiscally incompetent in terms of meeting the needs of the population. If you'll forgive me, I want to go into a little bit into history, because I think it helps us to understand what we can do, which is why did this slide in revenue collection as a percent of GDP start in around 1990. Now, there are several parts of that explanation, but I want to focus on one which is particularly important from the point of view of policy and action now. In 1990, which is almost 34 years ago, all but a month, when then President Premadasa introduced a change in fiscal management, which has been with us almost continuously since. Before that time, and since independence, Sri Lanka had always had a Minister of Finance who was a relatively powerful figure. And some of those ministers of finance were actually not only powerful, but very competent. We have people like Felix Dias Bandaranaike, N.M. Paara, Ronnie DeMel, fortunately 3 different political parties, who had been quite impressive and had managed the country's finances. The arrangement that President Premadasa introduced in April 1990 was that the Minister of Finance would either be the president, him or herself, or some very weak minister who was effectively a puppet of the president. And that, I believe, is a major issue to think about, because what has actually happened is that Ministry of Finance on a day-to-day basis has been run by a senior public servant, a very political public servant, different people, but the same general characteristic, very close to the president of the day, and using the Ministry of Finance for all kinds of purposes. I needn't go into the purposes, but what we've seen is a gradual evisceration, as they say, which is the really destruction of fiscal capacity, both on the expenditure side in terms of control of public finance and knowing where money is going, but also on the revenue side. And we've got into a really problematic position. On the revenue side, it means that, well, we have two main revenue agencies. Let's just concentrate on the Inland Revenue Department, because they're the ones that really need to step up and perform better. The Inland Revenue Department has had very little serious attention from ministers of finance for about 35 years, with very odd and rather brief exceptions. And we have an Inland Revenue Department that is extremely weak. And this is not a criticism of the people in that department, but some of the features of this are, Rohan, as you said, there's a software system that has been, well, coming up close to 8-9 years now, and is simply not fit for purpose and is way behind the capacity of the software systems that are used by inland revenue departments in almost all the world. We have a serious problem of lack of political support for the Inland Revenue Department to try and raise revenue such that people who feel that they're being asked to pay when they shouldn't pay can just run to a politician, and the Inland Revenue Department are told to back off. Frankly, we have rather poor quality staff. Only a small minority of the staff of IRD are actually trained accountants. And we could talk about many things, but I think this is a very important point when we talk about what should be done in terms of fairness, because it would be very easy for me, and I suspect many of you, to draw up a list of things we think should be done. But I don't think the Inland Revenue Department currently has the capacity to do many of them at all. It's an urgent issue to upgrade that department, but it's going to take time. So I think if we're going to think of what can be done, we need to think of some short-term things and some long-term things. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the things that could be done, but I want to start again with the point that you made earlier, Rohan. The current system seems very unfair, in the sense that with business income tax, personal income tax, and VAT, there are a lot of businesses and individuals who seem to be similarly placed, but one pays more tax than the other. And this reflects, I think, really two things. One is, as I say, we have a rather weak tax administration system that often fails, for example, to register people who should be registered, especially true of individuals. But it's also the case that as governments have been running down the whole fiscal system, they have been granting tax exemptions almost like confetti, as they say. And these have just come out more and more and more. And what I should also add here, I won't say much more, is that Sri Lanka is really unusual in the world in that we have legislation on the books that effectively gives the Minister of Finance the right to determine the tax rate for individual firms in some cases. And that is really, really unusual and is a great abuse of power and has been, I'm sure, widely abused. But let's talk more generally about all these tax exemptions. Now, I'll come back in a minute to what we do about the issue for individuals. But for companies, I suggested in the note you mentioned earlier, written with Umesh Moragurali, that we need to immediately review the system of tax exemptions for companies. In the last year, and thinking about this, I've somewhat changed my mind, and I think we actually need to do something more radical, because I fear that if we agree to review them, we're into a process that will last an infinite period of time and may not produce anything much at the end. I think what the government of Sri Lanka should do at present is simply abolish all income tax exemption exemptions for companies, both VAT and income tax, and say we are going to have one standard rate of VAT for companies and one standard rate of income tax for businesses, and that's what we'll do from now on. Now, you might react to that, gosh, isn't that a major violation of contract, maybe legally or possibly, if not legally, then in spirit? Well, to some extent, yes, but it's only a year ago that the government of Sri Lanka suddenly said to all its creditors, sorry, we can't repay to you the interest on the loans that we said we're going to repay. So if it's possible in times of economic emergency to violate your contracts in the case of debts, I don't see why we can't do the same thing in the case of tax exemptions. And I don't want to be too moralistic about this, but the fact is tax exemptions reflect an enormous amount of lobbying by companies. And frankly, one can't always blame companies because they are in a situation where other people are getting tax exemptions. But, the moral background on this is somewhat dubious. So I would think that would be a great thing to do. And it may be difficult to do anything else because information on tax exemptions is really not well available. I keep asking people in Sri Lanka, economists and others, where is the information on tax exemptions? And people go telling we don't have it. So that's the first thing I think should be done. The second thing that could be done quite quickly, not quite so quickly, but fairly quickly, is to begin to tax wealth, and begin to tax wealth not by introducing a wealth tax that would be really too problematic, but just introduce a reasonable tax on real estate, land and buildings on land, especially in Colombo and the Western Province. And the rationalization for this is, as I think everyone's very aware, property values in Colombo and the Western Province especially have increased enormously over recent decades. The taxation of property values is one of the most efficient taxes in the world for a range of reasons, but the most important reason is it doesn't discourage economic activity in any major way. But real estate in Sri Lanka is grossly undertaxed. We have a rate system and we have a system of taxing property transfers, but the revenue from those two combined is really trivial. So it's not doing anything. There are various options on this, but I think the simple way to do this would be to start again with a re-identification and revaluation of all real estate, especially that all real estate with buildings on it in the Western Province, maybe starting with Colombo, with contemporary digital technologies. That can actually be done really quite effectively if the government decides they want to do it. And within 2 or 3 years, we could have a reasonable system of property taxes, which don't have to be particularly high by world standards. I mean, they could be fairly low, would raise revenue. And I'll just make the last point, which is quite brief, Rohan, and then I'll finish. When it comes to the individuals and personal income tax, as we said earlier, it's fairly arbitrary at present. Some people are registered, some people are not. There are a range of ways in which the right people could be registered, or we get closer to the right people being registered without going to the extreme, as the President briefly hinted last September, that we should register all adults, which would make absolutely no sense at all and would just flood the Inland Revenue Department with useless files that they could never benefit from. But I won't at this moment trespass any more on your time. I can talk later about who should really be registered for tax, who isn't registered. Otherwise, I am concluded for the moment. I would be very wary of doing anything with the tax system in response to a perception about changes in company profit rates or excess profits. For 2 reasons, really. One is it's very difficult to interpret very often changes in company profit rates. Is it a genuine change in profit rates? Is it because of inflation? Is it because we've had so much economic upheaval in the last 18 months that something in the economy has resulted in a big change in rates? It's hard to interpret. So that's the first side. The other side is we currently have an Inland Revenue Department that is struggling very hard to do some very basic things. And I just don't think at the moment they have the capacity to go and inquire into detail in changes in companies' apparent profitability rates and do something about that. So my instinct is, while, as a citizen, I would always be worried that there might be some major tax evasion, pragmatically, at the moment, I would say don't do anything about it. And let me just add on that, I know there's been a debate about companies in Sri Lanka allegedly expatriating large amounts of profits to the rest of the world and therefore keeping money away from the tax man in Sri Lanka. I mean, I would say on that, I would be deeply surprised if it's not true, because there are practically very few obstacle companies trade what's called under invoicing or over invoicing and expatriating capital. But frankly, at the moment, there's nothing we can do about it. So I don't think there's a great deal of point in worrying too much about it. It's, until we get a more effective tax system that can start to monitor these things, I think we have to live with the limitations of our current tax apparatus. Basically, Winston, I mean, you're right. At the time of enormous hardship, to talk about raising taxes is very uncomfortable, and especially when I'm not a Sri Lankan, so I can happily say, oh, you folks should pay more taxes. But let's accept that reality. You basically say that there are two other sources of potential income that are not tapped. One is what you call pilfering from the Customs Department, Excise Department, and the Inland Revenue Department. And the other one is loans from state banks where they've been in default. I'm sure there is corruption in customs. There is in virtually every country I know, and sometimes in other departments. I would be surprised in the first place if this were big enough to make much difference to government tax revenue. And secondly, it's very hard to stop. So I'm not sure we could really rely on that. Again, defaulted loans from state banks, yes, but once companies have defaulted on them, it's very hard to get the money back. So, I mean, my personal view is that I don't think either of those routes will really contribute significantly to the big problem. And the basic problem is some people or some companies have to pay more taxes. And I still think we're at that level. Worldwide, very few people, are very eager to pay taxes, and we all like to complain. I don't think that actually Sri Lankans are very different from, the world average. So I don't think there's anything particular. But if there is a difference, and it's a fairly small difference, I think it goes back in history. I mean, the fact is that anything like, for example, that of Britain or Sweden or anything else, where most government revenue comes from personal income tax, a tax on our purchases, VAT or sales tax or something. If we go back historically to the time when the total tax collection in Lanka was fairly high, a very big component of that was taxes on the export of tea and rubber, which were not experienced directly by individuals. And indeed, one of the reasons that for this decline is that the source of tax revenue from the export of tea and rubber disappeared around 1980, and we never really substitute. So I think there's a little bit of historical, there's a little bit of a history here, but it's not clear what we do about that very clearly, because if we try and tell people they should pay their taxes, that message has to come from someone they trust and they like and they believe in. And I'm not sure that totally describes the current government of Sri Lanka. So we have a real challenge, and this is your problem, Sujata.
You're watching the Lifetraveler channel.